I've been involved in quite a few things since the original protests around the kind of Brown Review and the stuff that kind of erupted around after the coalition's reforms in 2010, 2011, and some of that was part of, somebody tweeted this morning an image of Tent City University, and it was like November. There was an event that happened in November 2011, and it kind of reminded me of it placed me back in a space that we were in, and felt like there was a lot of possibility. It felt like there was a lot of possibility in that moment. There was like a really rich energy in terms of kind of self-organization, in terms of what the possibility for kind of co-creating something new and something different might be. And there was in that moment of rupture, when all of a sudden we're escalating towards 9K fees, we're escalating the kind of corporate nature of the institution, we're looking to rapidly redefine that kind of direction, or to push to revolutionize that direction of travel, which is moving the institution away from any possibility of being cooperative. It felt like there was a moment of possibility that is kind of now, well, at times it feels like it's been lost. So I want to pick up on some of that in order to look at kind of where we are. I want to look at a little bit at kind of what informs my thinking around cooperation and the political economics of cooperation, and it's deliberately kind of Marxist, because that's kind of where I come from. It's not closed in that way, but that's my framing. I want to talk about some of the kind of the ways in which you might think about things like platform cooperativism in that kind of context of trying to do something different, and then I want to talk a little bit about the idea of the Cooperative University. And my engagement with the Cooperative University has been through the Social Science Centre in Lincoln. I was original kind of cooperator there, so I was involved in some of the discussions that we had around governance, around the management, in inverted commas, of the space, and in terms of kind of the pedagogy, the funding, those sorts of things, whether we wanted to have something that was formal, something that was accredited, or something that was informal and non-accredited, that was much more about kind of a reconnection with more historic ideas of what adult education in the community might be. From that, there were several opportunities or tensions in there, and moments in which people were thinking about forming or formulating a cooperative university as a potential response, and looking at things like Mondragon in the Basque Country as a potential model for doing something different. Some of that kind of ebbed away until I guess this kind of latest round post 2015 of rethinking HE funding and rethinking HE governance. And the Office of Students comes in, and we have another opportunity. So it's kind of, I want to think about the possibilities in the context of that new kind of regulatory framework. So that's my intention. Is that okay? I don't want to do something you don't want. Is that all right? And we'll rattle through it, he says, although he's got lots of slides. Lots of them have got pictures on though, so there's not lots of words for me to have to read out or any of that nonsense. We'll start here. Let's start from the current slide. So I'm interested, this is my starting point. So I'm interested, I suppose, in terms of thinking about the possibility for a cooperative university, not necessarily as a public university, as a different form of kind of common ownership. So we're thinking about the kind of regulation and governance in society in a slightly different way, and I'll come to that. But a lot of it comes from, as I've said, I suppose, some stuff that I've been engaged with or seen, or that's erupted. This is not to say that kind of we own this post-2010, because there's long histories and lineages of dissent and protest and pushing against the idea of what higher education is and what it might be and what the university stands for and its content and form. There are long lineages of that. But some of the stuff that's kind of been live for me, this is from the Really Open University, had an event in 2010, 2011 on reimagining the university. That university went into occupation at the same time, so that was really interesting in terms of the kind of dynamics in that space of the kind of student politics versus, well, what can we do in the community to do something different. We'll all remember the anarcho panda, I guess, from Quebec at the kind of turn of the decade as well, from the students protesting in Canada. Some stuff around kind of USS as well, and occupations in support of staff as part of the pension strike. And this is taken on some street furniture, and I'll come back to that. It's taken on some street furniture in Paris, in a northern suburb of Paris, but I'll come back to that. So there's it's at the intersection of these kind of moments, really, inside formal higher education, in the community, and the idea of kind of cooperation and cooperation in that space that I'm kind of interested. So we have these things that are going on in the current, in terms of thinking about the kind of the space that we're in, the regulatory and policy space that we're in. We know that a lot of this is framed by the Higher Education and Research Act. We're kind of aware of that, and that's instantiated the Office for Students as a regulatory body. But there are some other things that are kind of fundamental in this, and there's some other, and I think that this is important if we're thinking about what a cooperative university might achieve, or what it might be, or what it might deteriorate into. To pick up on kind of Rosa Luxemburg's kind of view of cooperatives operating inside a marketized space. So the HE Research Act, one of the things that kind of precede this I find interesting, the Treasury's kind of 2015 productivity plan is really interesting in terms of, for me, I'm going to say interesting and important way too often. They might not be interesting or important, they're just kind of my ticks, and I apologise for them now, but I find them kind of almost interesting or powerful or important moments. So that productivity plan, in terms of refocusing a discourse around kind of social goods or public goods or communal goods, or the provision of those in the notional public sector around productivity, it's a moment in which, for me, a lot of the discourse begins to change, and a lot of the discourse inside corporate institutions begins to change. It's linked to the Small Business Enterprise and Employment Act of 2015, which has as Appendix 6 educational evaluation, and that clearly links HRMC tax data to education outcomes data. So what we're trying to do there, or what the government's trying to do there, is set up a mapping effectively of, can we track these kinds of people from their early years baseline, foundation stage baseline data, right the way through to their PhD or their BA or BSc or whatever it is. Can we track them against their earnings potential, and I guess against their ability to repay their debts? So is that student who fits this profile, who does performing arts at De Montfort, how good are they for their, what value do we get for our 9K or 9,250 out of that? Should we subsidise that? Should we loan against that, as opposed to a student who's doing politics at Birmingham, or a student who's doing history or jurisprudence at Oxford? So this is really interesting in effectively setting this up, in effectively setting up the longitudinal educational outcomes data that the government is so interested in, and which kind of forms part of that sort of TEF framework, that teaching excellence and student outcomes framework stuff that we're all having to think about. Because one of the key outcomes there is around earnings and around employability, and that kind of, and now we have this focus upon value for money in the current review of higher education. So this is the kind of policy space which is very heavily framed on consumption inside higher education, student as consumer. It's very heavily focused upon human capital, the development of human capital and human capital theory. It's very clearly focused upon subsuming higher education within narratives of productivity and discourses of productivity. Framed around that, we also have this kind of ongoing feeding frenzy around a whole range of public sector spaces, including higher education, from a whole range of non-governmental organisations. So we have this kind of report from Reform on grade inflation, and what services what narratives can we sell in there, because that's really important if we're thinking about ideas around human capital, for instance. And actually, well, hell, do these students who've done performing arts at Institution X, what value is that against these students who've done a proper degree at a proper institution, and what does that mean in terms of the kind of social intellectual capital that they have and they carry with them, and the financial capital that comes out at the end? So there's all sorts of stuff that's going on in that space, and obviously we have a lot of stuff coming out around those other narratives around kind of prevent, for instance. I think what some of the research, certainly that thinks about this in terms of authoritarian neoliberalism, or neoliberal analyses of kind of higher education and this policy network and this frenzy around the edges of it, would focus upon the way in which the way in which I think about this is how higher education is becoming mediated, and how we are whether we have some form of ownership of the development of ourselves and the space. And this is important, I think, when we're thinking about kind of the idea of the cooperative university and why some academics and some students see that it might be an escape route, or an escape route out of the corporate institution and into something that enables them to breathe or to mediate their own existence, to self-mediate themselves inside an education space that is safe. I'll come to that in a second. So there is some writing. It's okay. There is some writing about higher education, the way in which it's being, the acceleration of its repurposing after 2010. And there is an idea around it's kind of the acceleration of its repurposing that focuses really upon more authoritarian forms of managerialism inside the institution, very heavy focus on public sector accountability and forms of kind of new public management, which are changing the kind of corporate relationships, issues to do with the development of human capital theory, and that then becomes a driving force for the development of curriculum and pedagogy and pedagogic practice and what happens inside classrooms. That so much of it is framed around marketization and financialization that money becomes the standard, and that in, for instance, the teaching excellence framework and the student outcomes section of that, money is the key metric. And Andrew McGettigan writes about this and writes about the longitudinal educational outcomes data being effectively the one metric to rule them all in a very two powers kind of way. So we have these discourses kicking in, which effectively, I guess, remove us from. There's a sense of kind of hopelessness here that we get kind of removed from what we thought the university was going to be and what it now is. And one of the ways in which I'm trying to think about that is that it's kind of it alienates us from ourselves. It doesn't enable us to kind of self-mediate our relationship both to our education and to the world and to society and to communal production, because we're mediating it through the market, and our way of trying to reframe or redefine ourselves is being kind of shut down. It's interesting then that we see that some of the collapse in participation rates for mature learners, part-time study. We also see rises in kind of reported staff and student health. Lots of reports of ill-being, overwork, exhaustion, anxiety, depression, that kind of thing. And so there's a kind of almost a toxic relationship inside of this. I'll come back to why that seems important in a minute. So the Office for Students has just issued the 24th, whenever that was, has just issued a week ago, has issued its guidance for providers about applying for degree awarding power. So institutions have already registered, have already been kind of agreed to register there. Part of the process there is that institutions, there are certain benchmarks for kind of getting registered, and some of those are in terms of things like having access agreements, having for students, for instance. These are some of the kind of, I've put this section up on the left-hand side here about the regulatory approach, which is kind of interesting because I think, again, it sets the kind of, it says some interesting things that can be interpreted as setting a particularly interesting set of narratives around the kind of discourse for higher education. So they're very clear that there's a student focus, and this is about the student, or the student and the student's family, almost, as a kind of competing capital, almost, at the level of society, rather than those of providers. So it's about the student's interests, set against, almost oppositionally, against the provider, and staff don't get mentioned. So I think that's kind of an interesting one if we're thinking about the idea of a cooperative approach. It's about risk-based approaches to higher education. So the accountability and public scrutiny is kind of fundamental in that moment. One of the other things that's kind of fundamental here is about competition in the market, and that you get that all the time. It feeds through quite a lot. So this is Michael Barber from the Office for Students. This is from his foreword in the consultation from 2017, the consultation on setting up the Office for Students. And he's very clear about the importance of universities, of a successful higher education for the country's economy and society. And he does talk about the joy and value of knowledge production in and of itself. And I love this about the pursuit of the good and the true and the beautiful. But he is very clear that this is about uncompromising protection, students' interests, value for money, the taxpayer. And it's a really, I think there's a moment in that, God, I'm trying so hard not to say interesting. There's a real moment in there of almost a dissonance between you can have it both ways. You can have the beauty of collaboration that enables you to flourish and to achieve your hopes and dreams, but at the same time this is about competition, and it's ostensibly about competition because the full consultation goes on to say that this competition is what drives up outcomes for students. Interestingly, it will also put on a downward pressure on costs, and that is generally going to be on variable labour costs and staff, that it's going to lead to more efficient allocation of resources between providers, and clearly they want market failure as well. So and they want new entrants into the space, which is one of the ways in which a cooperative university has a moment of potential, because they want that in as an alternative model. In part, in order to show that this isn't just about the corporatisation of the sector, as well to be able to sort of say, actually, this enables a more flourishing competitive market in that space, and that obviously it leads to innovation. So everything pivots from competition and the market, and those discourses are the pivot for the policy framework. They argue that it's well suited to market mechanisms driving continuous improvement, but they also, the bit that I haven't put in here is that they argue very clearly here that we've got crap information, we've got crap data at the moment. We need better data. The data does not enable students to make good enough, or their families to make good enough decisions about where to study and why, based on labour market outcomes, and that is a problem. And you might have seen there's been quite a lot of discussion around issues to do with learning gain and that kind of thing. So there's a lot of stuff in there about how individuals kind of signal to the market, pick me rather than her or him in that moment, and that agenda's still on that's still on the agenda. So in terms of the way in which I frame a lot of that, or trying to think about whether that cooperative moment, if the Office for Students is saying, actually, here's what the sector now looks like and we welcome new entrants, and one of those might be based on the Cooperative College, which it is, because the Cooperative College is registered and it's now applying for degree awarding powers. There's a moment in that in which we have to situate whatever that cooperative university might look like against a regulatory structure that is highly corporatised, focused on the market, focused on finance capital, focused on student outcomes around earnings, that situates higher education really against a kind of a longitudinal understanding of where students are as people and as individuals across the whole of their educational journey. So a cooperative university stitched, which attempts to have a governance and a regulation, a management and a funding mechanism, a set of pedagogies, is set against that broader societal field or domain, really. So I'm interested in whether that is feasible or possible. I'm not saying we don't do it, but there's all sorts of issues around what that means and how those layers interrelate. So this is what the International Cooperative Alliance says in terms of what a cooperative is. Forgive me if I'm teaching you how to suck eggs, because you know this, but it talks about it being autonomous, voluntary, some common interests in that. And I think that common economic, social and cultural needs is a thing to be considered, because certainly in terms of that relationship back to a sector environment that for some people regard as toxic. So is it possible for this kind of thing to happen inside a space that is toxic? There are a number of cooperative values. They're listed at the bottom: self-help, self-responsibility. So it's back to that idea of kind of self-mediation almost, rather than actually that you can breathe beyond the market almost. Issues to do with democracy, equality, equity, and solidarity. Those are the principles. So those are the values, and then a set of principles inside which all cooperatives, if they're signed up to the ICA definition and they want to register with that, have to operate. So there's potentially a set of tensions in that moment. Certainly based on, we'll come back to it in a second, but certainly based on whether we're thinking about the idea of cooperatives in terms of consumer cooperatives or producer cooperatives, the development of solidarity economies, and whether it's possible to set up social cooperatives, so cooperatives that operate beyond just the individual educational cooperative, and how are they mapped to other cooperatives that aren't necessarily going to be managed within an Office for Students regulatory frameworks. So I'll come back to that, but this is effectively, this is the kind of governing set of principles for a cooperative, technocratic cooperative university. Have to be able to kind of operate within that framework. And we know that there's a long history of, this like feels new, but there's a long history of a lot of this work happening. There's some that I've listed here because I've talked about them in other places. That's the Really Open University in Leeds, and that's the Social Science Centre in Lincoln, that operate as cooperatives that are that are formal or informal. And there's loads of people who've written about. It's not just these people, but there's loads of people who've written about co-ops in educational spaces as well, whether they can work or not. Oh yeah. So this is from Ridley, Duff and Ball from 2014, talking about the kind of historical influences of development of co-ops, and the stuff that I'm interested in where any discussion that we might have about the cooperative university and about what it might be being situated historically and also materially. And the material stuff is quite interesting for me because it does force us to think about, because the Office for Students sort of regulatory framework is very much about the consumption of higher education, and much as universities might talk about students as partners, the Higher Education Academy have talked about that. So as much as people might want to talk about co-creation, students as partners, students as producers, not students as producers, those two things, they generally focused upon consumption. So it's interesting that the 2010 white paper for higher education was about students at the heart of the system, and it had students as purchasers of educational products and educational commodities. And there's a real tension here, I think, when we're thinking about the cooperative university, about this idea of whether it's consumption or production, or whether it's both, and what does that mean then, in terms of trying to think about solidarity cooperatives that operate socially in a slightly different way and point towards a different set of outcomes. They also have this other model in terms of kind of the development of cooperatives at the level of society, where they're kind of thinking about people involved in the governance of those spaces, in terms of individuals having shares in those spaces as well, and what does that mean then for governance and regulation? And it connects to some other work that's been done on communalism and communitarianism, on the idea of labour-managed firms, treating the cooperative, almost the educational cooperative or the cooperative university, as a kind of democracy, as a democratic space, and how might that work within a very highly corporatised set of narratives. So there's some quite interesting stuff that's kicking in there. I guess my position is impacted by the way in which Marx has kind of looked at the development of kind of cooperative practice, and the way in which capital, as he argues here in volume 1 of Capital, mutilates the worker, because the idea of social labour is for the reproduction of capital. It's for the reproduction of capital at the level of society. It's about the extraction of value. It's about it's about capital. It's about value in motion. It's not about the development of individual capacities beyond the ability to generate surplus value. And I think that again is a moment of tension for those of us who work in higher education. I think where the landscape is framed around value, and if it is, then it's framed around exploitation, and therefore cooperative practice and the use of technology to generate that becomes a moment of either proletarianisation or it becomes a moment of exploitation. So Marx talks about the impoverishment of the worker in that moment. Earlier, he'd also therefore talked about the fact that this stultifies human life, because we generate material forces not in order to generate agency or autonomy, not in order to develop a human essence, not in order to develop a more powerful sense of what it means to be alive, but actually in order to lock down autonomy so that it only exists for capital alone. We generate material forces for one end and one end only, and it's not to liberate us from work, it's to situate us more formally inside work. So, should we talk about that? Let's not talk about that. I don't think I want to talk about that. Let's not talk about that. So, in terms of moving beyond it, no, I am going to talk about it. I want to talk about it. Let's talk about it. Negri in Marx Beyond Marx talks about kind of autodetermination, And I think that one of the ways in which some of the lines of thinking out of this come is that actually if we can reveal that moment inside which cooperative practice and the development of social labour is not an enabling activity, it doesn't enable us to self-mediate, it doesn't enable us to kind of mediate our own relationship with the world and with nature and with our own human activity and therefore with our sense of self, then we're screwed. But if we can reveal that, if we can reveal that moment of kind of alienation across an individual and social terrain, then are we able to begin that process of autodetermination, if we can reflect on that. So for me, there's a sense of there might be a deterioration in the Cooperative University down to becoming subsumed as yet another bastardised, corporatised, awful employer that is focused on cooperative consumption, but actually there might not be. That might be a crack. That might be a chink. That might be a moment of having a broader discussion. That, I guess, is important because in the German ideology, Marx and Engels talk about the fact that it's in community that we make these changes. That it's only in community that we understand our own essence. That we can decide that we want to teach in the morning, go fishing in the afternoon, look after our grandmothers in the evening, or whatever it is. It's only in that space that we can do that, and we do that by reducing down that kind of realm of necessity, by giving access to all to the kind of store of common goods, and widening the kind of realm of freedom or the realm of autonomy in order to self-mediate ourselves in the world. It is, and in Capital, he then goes on to talk about, I guess, kind of pointing towards worker cooperatives as developing that kind of or pointing towards the possibility of saying this isn't about developing the full capabilities of the species as alienated, value-driven workers, but actually as humans, and is pointing back to a sense of is cooperation a way of pointing towards humanity and being human again. So this is against kind of alienated socialization, or the concept of alienated socialization. And Marx is very clear, both in the instructions to the delegates here, but also much earlier in his comments on James Mill, that cooperation is that cooperative production is fundamental, not cooperative consumption. Cooperative production is fundamental, and he never describes this as being this is the answer. Do this. This is utopia. Is down this cooperative route. But he does talk about both in his critique of the Gotha program, the kind of the route towards both a lower and a higher engagement with communism has to come through association, and it has to come through the community, and it comes through cooperative production, cooperative material production of everyday life. And that is the way in which he deeply connects us back to a sense of what it means to be human, what it means to generate your own essence of who you are in the world, not one that is, oh my God, I've got to put food on the plate, I've got to pay the mortgage, we're being restructured again, I've got 700 student essays to mark, I've also got ref deadlines, I've also got, because the argument is that we're kind of dehumanized in that moment. So there's quite a lot of, in terms of that, for me, Marx talks quite a lot about this idea of the form and content of social production and cooperative production. There's something in there. There's quite a lot of work, Huey Newton's work on revolutionary intercommunalism, or Murray Bookchin's work on what it means to be liberated, and the role of technology in that. So is the use of technology, can technology liberate us if the governing principles for society are locked down? And that's one of the ways in which I kind of look at the idea of a cooperative university. And in particular, I connect that to Luxemburg's focused on the degeneration thesis that inside a competitive space, any cooperative is just going to degenerate and become meaningless. Clearly, Lenin had a different view that actually cooperatives and cooperative societies might be a way out. Certainly to bring the proletariat into a sort of a sense of understanding the revolution. Now, this isn't, for me, this is kind of, the situation of that is kind of important for me, because I hear more kind of cries of distress, I guess, from inside kind of higher education. And one of the things where people are looking at the Cooperative University, some of the things that, there was a brilliant, I wrote about it on my blog, there was last November there was a conference about setting up the Cooperative University. Did anybody manage to go to that? No, it was at Manchester at the Cooperatives UK, Cooperatives College, and there were a raft of people there who were just not just academics. There were activists in the space. There were people who were involved in cooperatives as well, and there was a definite evangelical kind of air to it, and a definite sense of, oh my God, this could be liberatory about it, and it had the feeling of almost of a what you kind of imagine or read about as almost a sort of a revivalist sort of space, and a lot of that for me, I was thinking about that a lot in terms of this idea that academia, it's a kind of an escape from an academic space that operates like the peloton in professional cycling, so where effectively teams of individuals are calibrated around the highest performing individual, the team leader, so everybody is a kind of almost like a domestique or a servant of that person, and that the team can only survive or progress based on the success of that one individual. So I'm kind of interested in playing around with that metaphor in terms of higher education, and therefore the subsumption of certain identities around high-performing individuals, but also the fact that you have to recalibrate your performance around the performance of that high-performing individual as well. And within the context of that, there are these kind of cultures of omerta or silence in that as well. So you don't speak out against exploitation, domination, oppression. You don't speak out necessarily about depression or anxiety or ill health or ill-being. You focus on becoming more resilient. You go to those HR-led courses on becoming a more resilient performer. That culture of silence that enables kind of doping in professional cycling, for instance, and enables forms of punitive performance almost, kind of I see as a little bit of a mirror of the kind of performative culture inside higher education, and that kind of enforces forms of silence in that space. So for me, it was interesting because that meeting last November I saw almost as a kind of a moment of it's a kind of deep reflection almost, or a mirroring of those sort of forms of despair that you read about online. Sort of a raft of people talking about this quick lit about why people are leaving academia, students or staff reporting on mental health. Universities UK have that big thing now on pushing forward kind of as a mental health strategy as well. I kind of written about it for 1KG on academic ill health. But this idea that actually we write about it, Kate Bowles in Australia and I have written about it in terms of kind of sublimated competition, where we have kind of conditional cooperation over and desperation over position and status inside the formal institution, that shapes a space in which certain things are normalised. Effectively self-harm, culturally acceptable forms of self-harm are normalised. And I raise this, and I don't want to over-egg it, but I raise it because I think that it shapes that kind of cooperative, almost the desperation for the Cooperative University is a reflection of this, and I think that's quite important in terms of how we then think about whether it's possible, how it might be governed or managed or regulated. I'm wondering about whether I'll talk a little bit about this. I chanted way too much. It's like, we've only done like 25 slides and I've been banging on for like half an hour. Current slide. I'll just do I don't want to do this. I don't want to do that. Should I do this section?
We'd have maybe a Q&A or a short discussion and then move on to the next section.
Yeah, let's do that. I'm bored of talking.
Is there anything anyone wants to sort of say I'm wrong about, or hassle me about, or comment on?
Question there, because I've been interested in this question about teacher-student relationship. Did my study of sociology here. My dissertation was about the teacher-student relationship in relationship to the teaching of Marxism, particularly at the university. I basically found out two things. The first one was that, and it was quite a small study, there was only like 6 people, 6 interviews, but I found out a couple of things. Like one of them was that there is this kind of like students that take the more critical approaches to social science tend to be more actively do you really, what sort of communications do you actually have with your peers, and what kind of engagements do you have with your peers? And like the GTAs, every one of the GTAs said the same thing. They were like, oh, we've got a really good community on the 10th floor. Like, you know, someone will come in every day after a seminar, and they'll come in and they'll say, this happened and this happened and this happened. And we'll sit there when it's break time, we'll talk about it, and we'll trade ideas and trade, and we help each other develop and so on. Whereas when I interviewed like the academics, lecturers who were lecturing big lectures, they would all say, like, never speak to anybody. Like, the only time I ever speak to anybody about anything to do with this is if a student is looking as if they're literally going to fail their degree. And then I may speak to one of my colleagues about it, but until that point, until the sort of like crisis point hits, they just don't talk to each other. They all seem to be very isolated. And I was wondering whether or not that was something that you'd experienced in the universities yourself, and how you would see that maybe playing out differently in the Cooperative University.
I think the one of the things I was going to talk about was this is the list of some of the organisations that were involved. So like there was when the cooperative, back in October 2017, just before that kind of the conference that I mentioned before, there was a board meeting there that was that was one of the board members, Nigel Todd, saying that they were committing themselves to exploring the feasibility of a co-op, formerly as kind of part of the government's white paper, the HE and Research Act, and then the formation of the Office for Students. We're all in on this. We're in on this. One of the issues there then is, well, and these are some of the organisations that they were thinking of having. One of the big issues was, I guess, within that, and I will get to your point, was that, well, what does that look like then? What does the governance of that and the management of that look like on the ground? Because are you going to have a federation? Are you going to have a federation of institutions, and therefore, who drives the pedagogy in that space? Who drives the student experience in that space, in a kind of federated space where the degree awarding powers are held with the Cooperative University, but you've got delivery mechanisms elsewhere? So one of the ones that I'm involved in is Vaughn College, which has a history. It's got like 150-year history of delivering adult ed courses, some of which are accredited through the University of Leicester, and some of which are not. So you've got Vaughn College delivering some stuff, and there's a pedagogic thing going on, and a set of student experiences going on, and an access agreement notionally in that level. But then they've got a relationship to the co-op college, and also to all of these others if they were going to deliver stuff as well. And then you've got the imposition of the stuff, bless you, from the Office for Students, and there's a whole series of possible tensions all the way down the route in terms of trying to make sense of what does that look like on the ground then. But I think in terms of the generation of because like in April, subsequently 6 months later, they moved to register, went to this kind of information event with the OFS, and now they're working. We are, because I have been part of that, working towards gaining degree awarding powers and developing a model, and that's the fundamental bit really. The model, because it's like what are the principles upon which that space might be modelled, and so all of the documentation around this is. And the way in which I guess it kind of it reflects on the relationships that you're talking about, but also the kind of the construction of the curriculum, because a lot of the construction of the curriculum has been, do you have individual subjects like we have now, which are then TEFable, and in order to get degree awarding powers, you have to, if you want to charge the 9,250 or you want to charge the $9,000, you have to be TEFable. You have to be part of the TEF, which means that, and in order to do that, certainly if they instantiate subject-based TEF, then you've got to have a relationship to subjects. So where does interdisciplinarity sit inside that if we're thinking about your approach to having a sort of a critical social science disciplinary flavour within a cooperative university? How does that situate with biologists or with performing artists or with historians or whoever it might be? That's an intriguing moment, I think. And what we might want at Vaughn College might be
is that feasible or not? And does it get bastardized because it has to fulfill certain other corporate technocratic demands? I think that's a tension, definitely a tension. Also because everything pivots around public interest governance principles. So if you're going to get degree awarding powers, you're going to be a cooperative university regulated by the Office of Students, you have to apply those accountability risk. It's all risk-based, it's rooted in notions of kind of new public management and accountability there, and it's predicated on value for money for the consumer. You know, so those principles I think are interesting. At the same time, we are trying to work towards a federation of autonomous cooperatives. That's the stated aim, to work towards a federation of autonomous cooperatives linked to that ICA definition of what a cooperative is, and that's really important. But it affects everything. So there's some real, so I guess in terms of where I see it all the time. I'm UCU casework coordinator at DMU, and you get deluged with people talking about what they're struggling with, but also their isolation in that space, you know, and that they're not necessarily having those. There are loads of spaces for those conversations, but you have to, I guess we're back to almost like a Moten and Harney, Undercommons, the university. Where can we grab those spaces inside a space that is meticulously performance managed, where every quota of, every quantum of time is potentially locked down. These are your hours. You've got 1569 hours in the year, and this is your teaching, and this is your research, this is your admin, and this is your allocation for assessment, and all of that. There are all of those tensions in there for individuals that I hear when I hear you. Some of the tensions in the Cooperative University are that these are the things that they're working on. Definitely access and participation agreements. What do they do about outreach? In particular, because the focus has to be on those who have been lost in inverted commas to the system, mature learners. What are we doing about engagement with Black, Asian, minority, ethnic? Carers, people who are coming from care as well, people on low incomes, people with, and this is what the Cooperative College are very heavily focused on, working with refugee communities, working with this whole range of people who we might, some of the research, so Claire Callender's work on part-time students, on mature learners, are being lost to the system. You know, so there's a very definite focus through in that way, and then therefore, what are the support mechanisms for that? And also, what are the pedagogic implications of that? So what does pedagogy mean inside a cooperative university? And therefore, can we own the idea of students? So like, then we get to Mike Neary's work on, potentially on student as producer, that was kind of incubated at Lincoln, and takes some of the work of Walter Benjamin, amongst others. And this is a rambling answer to your question, isn't it? But it has helped me re-energise. There's Mike Neary and Joss Wynn in the Open Library of Humanities. They write this piece, but there's a special collection on the abolition of the university. They've done quite a lot of work for the Leadership Foundation in higher education on cooperative models of HE and what they might look like, looking at other models of potential cooperatives, or I don't know, the kind of the John Lewis model, for instance, or looking at Mondragon and trying to look at whether it is possible to generate something new and what the principles that underpin that might look like. And they have this lovely sort of Soviet visualization over here, trying to think about the ways in which knowledge, democracy, bureaucracy, livelihood and solidarity might be generated inside an institution. And that, I think, then reflects on the point I think that you've been trying to make about, well, what do the relationships look like inside this space? Because at the moment they're broken. The relationship to the curriculum, the relationship to our students, the relationship between students and between academics and themselves, or academics and professional services staff, are broken. So what can we do something different? And I think that's, to me, that's kind of important, because the governance has taken up the governance of what a potential cooperative university might be has taken up so much of the discussion. It's pretty much all been predicated on the governance, and some of the pedagogy has been well worked through. It's been thought about over a period, and there's stuff coming out of Adult Ed or the Workers' Educational Association or whatever it might be that enables us to kind of rethink some of that. But the governance is really interesting because you've got a governance you've got a governance relationship with the Office of Students and therefore the regulator and the government. You've got a governance thing with your own members, which might be organisational because it might be Leicester Vaughn College, or it might be the Social Science Centre in Lincoln, or it might be whoever else, because you're trying to build this autonomous federation, so there's a relationship there. There's a relationship then to your subcommittees that you're contracting stuff out to deliver around finance or whatever. You've got your own academic board, you know, there's a principal, a management team, there's delivery teams, because the Cooperative College isn't, in its first instance when it goes for degree awarding powers, he's probably going to see you. Have a safe journey back to Manchester.
Thanks very much.
Has got a... I said we'd have finished and we haven't finished. We should send him the slides. He wanted the slides. We should send him the slides. At the moment, the Cooperative College doesn't have a history of delivering degree awarding courses or programs at the moment itself. It's done lots of courses, but it doesn't have that lineage, whereas Leicester Vaughn College, for instance, which I'm on the board for, am I ruining this now? Because like I'm doing this kind of little, and you're going to have to cut all those bits out. I apologise if I am. You know, it'd be rubbish for anyone who wants to watch this online. Leicester Vaughn College has a history of delivering degree awarding powers, and those delivering degree awarding courses, sorry, as well as non-accredited. This is what they want to do once, or this is what they're sort of pointing towards, which will be some counselling related, because they have a lot of expertise in kind of counselling, mental health, that kind of thing. Some stuff to do with kind of that they're generating in terms of kind of the humanities, the broader humanities as well, and there's courses that are running at the moment around those. The idea is that they will then that will then filter out into these areas. Some that's interdisciplinary, some that's humanities based, and some that's then rooted in kind of counselling and mental health. And that those will come through kind of CPD courses, non-accredited provision at the top, you know, that might be this kind of pre-certification stuff, that will then come into kind of HE certificates that might then lead to through undergrad to postgrad stuff. And in the first instance, it isn't the final thing. In the first instance, we go where the energy is, because they have people providing in these spaces as courses get run out at Leicester. But there's a real issue there, I think, in terms of those relationships, the intersection of those relationships between regulation at the government level, what the Cooperative University has to do for that, but also what it needs to do to enable these courses to work and the relationships to work. In part because we then come up against Luxembourg's point about degeneration. Is this feasible inside a highly marketised and quite toxic environment?
That was a good answer.
It was sprawling though, wasn't it? It was like about 7 or 8 minutes of jibber jabber.
Because my interest really when I went into that research was like the neoliberal subjectivity type angle. You know, it's kind of like all neoliberalism's about turning everybody into this sort of like atomised egotists. And I looked at it and I was like, well, it sounds like a lonely place to be.
I think, I mean, it's important to recognise your position, isn't it? Because therefore I have to recognise my position, which is, you know, I've just written a book on alienation, so you know what I mean. I'm not coming at it from I think it's a happy place, you know what I mean. Let's all drink the Kool-Aid or whatever. I'm not coming at it from that. So I have to recognise my own position, and I'm not saying that it's like that for everybody, you know. But I think that there is a sense, and there's quite a lot of research that would kind of, well, what does subjectivity mean in that space then? Both for, and that's not just for, if we're trying to think about this cooperatively, because one of the things in there is that the pedagogic principles upon which some of those courses are developed, but also, and Kerry Facer writes about this in a thing on cooperative schools as well, is that cooperation, the idea of cooperation, in the same way that you were talking, I guess, about social science curriculum, also a social science way of thinking inside of the curricula, is kind of maps across the idea of kind of cooperative pedagogic practice, or the development of cooperative relationships inside classrooms, and so there's something here about these principles, I think, when we're thinking about the the pedagogy that exists inside a space and what subjectivity might therefore mean, and that idea of us becoming more associational beings. Quite a lot of the research and writing is about how do we embed cooperation then as a mode of praxis of changing the curriculum, of changing ourselves, of changing our relationship to the content we produce, and what therefore does that mean? If I bothered to look at these slides up here, blah 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 blah, where we're thinking about, say, platform cooperativism and that idea that are there technologies that exist out there that might enable us to generate new forms of cooperatives, and are they the way in which we take current digital platforms and repurpose them? Part of the thinking about that is, well, who designs and who defines the sort of algorithms upon which that's based? And so what are the issues around epistemic privilege in there? What about intersectional issues in there? Who has a voice in there? Who has a voice in the generation of the cooperative? And what therefore does that mean? You know, I teach first year education students, and it's largely very young female students of colour, you know, and they're being lectured by the middle-aged white man, you know, and it's there's a real, and I find that very challenging in a good way, you know, but I have to think about all of these issues all of the time in trying to make that space a cooperative space. And I think that's one of the things as well that when we're thinking about the Cooperative University, people have been thinking about is, well, is what happens at kind of level 4, you know. So if we're thinking again about think about that, you know, what students come in with on their introductory counselling course on day 1 of week 1, and where they are and who they are, and the traumas that they've been through and all of that is not the same as it is down here. So what does that mean then for partnership or cooperative pedagogic practice or co-creation or students as partners or whatever? I do think that there's a sensitivity around that in terms of trying to generate a more meaningful set of spaces or trying to understand it in a way that is potentially qualitatively different from the corporate institution, potentially. I don't know what to do now. Do we have more questions? Do anyone want to say anything? Want to disagree with anything? There's a thing and a thing and a thing. Who wants to go first?
Yeah,
I'm very interested to hear a bit more about how Cooperative University can be achieved, some practical ways to make it happen. In general, but also specifically, not necessarily within cooperative universities, but within universities in general, which are not cooperative. How do you introduce?
That's
Because
interesting.
I mean, that's
That's
what we,
interesting.
you know, we want to work towards.
That's interesting. Joss Wynne at Lincoln, as part of that sort of project on looking at that Leadership Foundation for Higher Education project, there's a report on their repository about it. He wrote a paper in 2015 in Power and Education about it, and he talks about the possible sort of routes into cooperative, to cooperation. So is it possible to set up kind of almost like Trojan horses within institutions that are always being restructured? So can you set up research institutes or research centres or that operate along cooperative lines and principles? Is that possible? So that's a possible way in. Is it possible to kind of convert existing institutions? And the argument is it's doubtful because because VCs coming in as CEOs don't want to do that. It materially affects issues to do with status and privilege and power for them, and also it disrupts the standard model, so it becomes quite difficult. He also talks about the creation of new spaces, and I guess in the kind of the formation of the Cooperative University, these are already existing. These aren't the only ones. These aren't the only sort of partner organisations that in the creation of an autonomous sort of federation of cooperatives that the Cooperative University has been talking with. There are others, and I think that some of it's quite interesting because some of them are, so say like the Bristol Learning Co-op and the Free University of Brighton are set up in the community to deliver social learning, adult learning, co-created learning, community projects without necessarily having, they do have some form of formal curriculum in the same way that the Social Science Centre does, but it's kind of non-accredited, whereas Leicester Vaughn College is much more structural, has a history, has a set of governance processes. It's existed within Leicester University since the 1960s. It delivers accredited programs. It's got formal academics working within it, delivering and understand and engage with issues to do with student experience, access to library resources, what the technological infrastructure would have to be. So there's a whole range of other organisations that the Cooperative University is acting as a pivot for, like an umbrella for. It's trying to act as almost a distributive network for the production of cooperation. The pivotal thing, I guess, in that will be that it's got that it's working with Vaughn College in particular, because its marker for in this is, can we deliver degree programs? The tensions in that are then, what are we going to charge for that? Because if we're trying to make a claim socially, do we want to rush straight to £9,250 or £9,000, depending on whether we get TEF Gold or not? Do we want to rush to that? What message does that send? Whilst at the same time recognising that most of that debt is written off, and therefore the student will have it, but won't necessarily be repaying it at the end, but they'll still be carrying that debt. But by charging £9,000, you would potentially enable a richer learning environment and a richer set of experiences than you do if you charge £6,000, because there's different things that you can kind of do with that in terms of student experience. So there are all sorts of tensions that need to be kind of played out or worked through if you're going to go down the creation, back to that model. You're going to go down the creation route, because the creation exists you're still within a marketized system. You're still trying to exist in that space. So one of the other alternatives is that you say, actually, we're not going to play in that space, but people still have to put food on the table and they have to pay their mortgages, and that's an issue. You say, I'm not going to play in that space. We'll because some of those other organisations exist in the community as autonomous community projects. They exist as organisations that are trying to support people after work, that have different approaches to childcare and caring responsibilities, that organise conferences around that try to support learning at the level of society in a different way. They're not interested in accreditation, for instance. They're interested in doing live community projects that might change the lives of people locally or just upskill them. There's a possibility that you then look at developing solidarity economies that connect these people to people who are fighting for an NHS Reinstatement Act. They're fighting around welfare cuts. They're fighting around at the level of society for other things, and you don't necessarily focus on education as a thing, as a fetishised thing. You focus on it in terms of wider social change. So I think there are a lot of those other tensions that are in place around if this is formal, is it going to degenerate? Is it absolutely going to degenerate, or have to become something else, and therefore can talk about cooperativism in its kind of form, but the content of it will get emptied out? Is it possible that doesn't say we don't do it, but that we are constantly aware of that and try to enact something else? And is it possible as well to kind of seed those other possibilities inside institutions? Now, I tried to do this in my own, and it failed. So we tried to make things cooperative in terms of an institute that I was running, but people there was no ownership of it locally, because people almost aren't used to that process. It can take quite a lot to get people enculturated into ways of working and governing themselves and managing themselves and deciding on allocation of resources, deciding on workload planning in a cooperative way inside an institution that operates in a very corporate form, where workloads, for instance, and targets, appraisals are managed in a very specific way. So you always, from inside the institution, your cooperative values tend to run into a corporate way of managing or delivering the institution.
You have this new way of
Yeah.
transformative way of doing research, or transformative way of addressing social needs. How can you embed them within a system that's not only unconducive to them, but that is the very reason that you are doing this stuff in the first place?
Yeah. And my answer is I don't know. But we keep go. Sorry.
Yeah. So where does that leave us?
it leaves us in a space where we have to keep opening up the cracks for dialogue about this. So the Cooperative University it's a problematic space because I guess my position is it's a problematic space because it runs into established forms of power. But at the moment, it's the least worst thing we've got on the table, and it offers a possibility, and it also offers a possibility for us for engaging with. I'm not fetishizing Mondragon, for instance, but it offers us an opportunity for opening up connections, more broader, global, transnational networks of cooperation to other educators, because there are all sorts of examples in Latin America as well of cooperative practice and cooperatives running labour managed firms after the crash in Argentina, or of other educational spaces opening up, the way in which Ecuador tried to reinvent had a national strategy based on good living, tried to reinvent the way in which it reproduced society. That was between 2009 2013. So there are lots of examples of where these are being done. I think part of the thing is for the discussion about those possibilities to be constantly maintained and reinvented. So when I say I don't know, it's because there is no utopian position that says this is what it will look like and that's how we'll get there, because I don't believe that exists inside a system that is constantly reinventing itself in the face of austerity. So I find that that's really difficult. But actually this thing exists. There are other cooperatives that exist at the level of society that are educational as well. And I think it's difficult, isn't it? Because we've got day jobs, and we have to, and as I've said before, we're committed to the workload of those day jobs. But at the same time, it's finding moments in which we can be part of this, and in which we can replicate those organisations. For me, it occurs in that first year module as well, because I'm trying to teach cooperatively with those students, or I'm trying to embed the idea of cooperativism with those students. And actually, can we co-create your assessments? What does peer review mean in that moment? What does co-creation of content mean in that moment? You need to bring me content that we can share. It isn't just coming from me, and it ain't just about what's going on in primary schools in Wandsworth. It might be about what's going on in the little schools of the Zapatista, that you're interested in, or whatever it might be. So I think it operates at those range of scales, but part of it for me is that there isn't we get to that point. It's, well, where are we going now, and can it be cooperative? Because I have no answers, only lots of, what do we do? This is wrong, what do we do? I feel like I failed you. Justin.
Yeah, well, what I want to know in the future is there's some parts of the states get the merging of public and private, so corporations start to merge with universities because it's much cheaper. You get the content digitalised and you can pass it on around multiple campuses. The campuses can be the brands that deliver it, you can casualise the workforce, drive down the costs. And in that case, if there's a constant pressure to keep driving down the costs or having a few research stars employed on contracts, as long as they keep getting grants in and highly casualised, much cheaper teaching workforce, whether a co-op would actually be financially sustainable if you wanted people to be employed on the ordinary decent living wages, when the way it's going now with universities as autonomous institutions is constant driving down of salary costs, increasing locality. One of the scenarios that times 10 with digital technology and emerging corporations, which are massive, which is why mostly education in some third and south countries post-school is ripe for the picking. We get these brands, we do deals with vice chancellors who want their branding projects, want the money rolling in, all that pushes down staff costs. When we help the last generation to go almost completely out of this.
Yeah.
But in terms of co-ops, then whether it's actually feasible to do it, if it's not a purely voluntary in the evening basis, because the staff costs for the person who is a teacher, researcher, and administrator, decent living salary would be too much.
It's been a really live conversation all the way through the time that I've been involved in some of those discussions from 2010 has been if this can only be, you know, sort of in the evening, if this can only be on a Saturday, it ain't, you know, what's the point? It ain't going to work. It's got to be. We've got, and this is why I think some of the conversations have always been about the idea of the, where did I have that? The public university. You know, this has to be about we reclaim the idea of the public university, and some of the other conversations in that space being around, well, how is that possible inside a space in which there's an emptying out of the idea of the public, or a reframing of what that actually means, and that actually with what we're thinking about here, Jocelyn might talk quite. I think we might talk about it in that mass intellectuality book actually. I think about we're going beyond this idea of public ownership and thinking about kind of common ownership, and that technology is kind of important in that because it potentially reframes the idea of sort of property in that moment. But there's a real debate there, I think, about the public versus the common versus the communal versus the cooperative, and what it might mean in that space. And certainly in a space where things are being proletarianized, you're dead right. But that's happening in other sectors, and that's happening more broadly. And does that, and how do we, is it possible therefore to raise consciousness around, or to discuss consciousness and subjectivity around that, and what that means then, in particular where people are having to work longer hours, where they've got shitty pension rights, where they've got no welfare rights, where their mental health is being destroyed, all of where there's loads of ill health, and can we join those things up whilst talking also, I guess, back to that point from Marx about, is there a possibility for kind of reflecting that back to people and talking about how that level of sociability or society has been perverted, bastardized, but actually it might enable us to do these things. That's happening on the one hand. On the other, you're dead right. Those models for funding people for wages inside cooperatives, I think at Mondragon, is it 1 to 3 from the top pay to the, is it 1 to 3? I've got 1 to 3 in my head anyway, in terms of kind of the ratio, you know, and the ratio, I don't know what it is here. It's probably ludicrous, right? It's probably 1 to whatever, you know, between your VC and your lowest paid professional services. You know, so certainly inside, some of the conversations that happen inside Leicester Vaughn College are, well, how flat is that? How flat are the hierarchies? How flat are the pay structures? What are the minimums that we expect here? And what will that kind of 9K, if we go for the 9K fee thing rather than say 6, what will that enable us to do in terms of a living wage for people? And what other services and bursaries would we be able to provide? But you're right, it's a huge tension, because over here, labour costs are being annihilated across the piece. And we have no sense of consciousness raising with the professoriate who won't necessarily come out on strike or won't necessarily be on the picket line. I'm not saying they aren't, right? Some are. But is there a sense that it is an academic peloton where the status is everything? And we've sold that idea that we can become, this is your career path for certain individuals, and you're sold on that, and that's the. So is a cooperative university is it gonna mirror that? What does status look like? What does privilege? What does power look like inside that? Because you're trying to operate again inside this space, and these are questions that all need raising, but they need raising in such a way that we question that as well. I think not just is there a better version that we can do over here, but actually what does that look like then, and actually how does that mirror privilege and power at the level of society, and what does that mean for epistemic privilege, and what does that mean for intersectional privilege? So you're dead right, that's been live for me in almost every conversation or every setting, every context I've been in. That's been a visceral thing, because people have to provide and all of that, but they can see that stuff's being eviscerated on the side, and their access to stuff is being eviscerated on the side, but we want that. And there's no alternative. There's no utopian over here. I don't know what we do about that other than constantly outing it, but we need that. There's that form of solidarity, isn't there, all the way down that's kind of required. I'm very good at not answering questions but going on a ramble. That's what I've realised. Sorry. Did you want to follow up on that? Sure. Okay.
I've been really interested in the SSC, the Social Sciences Centre at Lincoln, and it's been going on for quite a few years, and I was wondering, so you've been involved in it. Can you tell us about a week in the life of a student scholar or a teacher scholar? How does it work, and what can you tell us about experiences of says there that students can do a PhD or a BA, although the center does not award formal degrees. How does that work?
The Social Science Centre, I'm kind of now tangentially involved in, so you'd have to talk to people have kept blogs like reflective diaries of their engagement, and students have kept reflective diaries of their engagement inside the space as well. So it does run courses. So this one is from 2016 on the sort of social science imagination and an engagement with what kind of social science and the kind of the criticality that we were discussing earlier might mean within a range of kind of projects. It has kept going, and I think the individuals within it, there's quite a lot of writing about the Social Science Centre that Joss Winner and Mike Neary have kind of written about, and they're much better placed than I am. But there's a number of kind of strands that kind of lead into it. So you have that kind of idea that the government is going to cut funding or subsidy, for sort of social science courses. University of Lincoln doesn't teach sociology, so it's not a direct competitor with that university. A group of academics decide they want to set up something autonomously within the city, and they've got a good network of other groups or other spaces, other adult learning spaces, other welfare providers in the city that they can kind of network and work with. It's been going, it was incorporated, I think I was one of the original signatories to the kind of the Articles of Incorporation back in about 2010, so it's been going a long time. It's the longest standing of them, but there are not hundreds of people, not hundreds of students involved in the course. Are you on the mailing list? Yeah. So you'll see the level of kind of interaction, and there's been quite a fluid. Interestingly, I think there's been quite a fluid set of relationships in that space, and it can be very intense because, like, you've got a limited number of people, and you've got academics, professors working with a whole range of people, some of whom have not, have finished school at 16 or whatever, and then have gone out, and it's quite, when you're coming in then for evenings or weekends, and people are tired and all of that, and you've got caring responsibilities or whatever it might be. That's an intense space, and you've got a constant. One of the really interesting things I think is the ways in which people have to constantly work at the relationships and have to constantly work at the space. And it can be very intense in that way, and there's been quite a lot of people coming and going in and out of the space. Right, I'm done with the space.
How big is the class size?
Can be quite small. Not talking huge, although at the annual lectures you would have bigger numbers. And they did a cybernetics lecture series because there was a guy who was originally involved in the CyberSyn project under Allende's Chile, who and they might be online actually, though, recordings of those events. So they're online, and there would have been more people involved in those. And I think there is a need to try and get some sort of continuity in that space. I think they've tried to do that around the kind of the negotiations around the governing principles and the ways in which meetings would work. So with sort of seeds of change coming in, that kind of thing, and well, how might we manage meetings and governance in a more democratic way without the same people holding the conch and being the only people who have a voice in the space? And that could be quite painful as well, because you know what academics are like. It's a kind of, I've got the answer, except for me, I've got the answer, we can do. So that then becomes that can become a bit of a trial, I think. It's the same, but there can be quite a power in the co-negotiation of the kind of the way in which the courses are going to run. And so I think it's really interesting that it operates in a number of ways. It operates in terms of the democracy and the governing principles of the space and the thing, and what are we going to do about childcare, and what do we do about feeding ourselves for a day-long session on a Saturday. So there's the organising principles and the governing principles and the way in which it operates. That's one level of negotiation that happens. And then you've got the curriculum stuff. There's the form of the thing and the content of the thing that is being negotiated as well. And this is one of the that we come back to if we were looking at trying to convert an existing institution or to have to kind of dissolve an existing institution. We want to do all of that, but we have to do the corporate as well, and it's exhausting. To do the pair of them is exhausting. So it operates. So I think it's ebbed and flowed. Doesn't have huge numbers. It's still there, and I guess it's a bit of it's a potential blueprint for other stuff. Now, the stuff in terms of kind of you can come and do a PhD with us or whatever, is that you would be working with people who understand the higher education quality framework. They understand what it means to work, what the descriptors would be for a PhD, what the level descriptors would be for a master's or a level, you know, sort of a final year undergrad degree. So you could be offered, you could negotiate what a project might look like that would enable you to meet those descriptors, and you would get a transcript or even a sort of certificate from inside the institution, but it won't be validated by the Office for Students yet. If the Cooperative University gets degree awarding powers, then there is the potential for those co-negotiated cooperative projects then to be validated. So in terms of you'd have to ask a student what it felt like to be involved in that. My limited take on it would be that for some it's empowering, for some it is deeply, deeply frustrating because of that constant ongoing negotiation and renegotiation of the relationships of the space, of the content, of all of that. It's always, you know, there's nothing more frustrating and beautiful than your relationships with other people. But at times they're really, you know, people have traumas and all sorts, and people are tired, and people have got caring responsibilities and all of that. You know, I think but all of this, the messiness of all of this is one of the things that, you know, when you've got the Office for Students wants a clean look and feel, it strikes me, for UK higher education, rooted in a risk-based approach to trusting relationships, which it talks about. It's got a very clear view of consumption of higher education commodities, but that isn't we know that isn't the way in which the classroom works.
I was assuming that the academics involved in the project would be very aware and would have a lot of discussions about power relations. So
Yes, they are. They do. Yeah.
So that's
It's fundamental.
good. And then I was wondering how did the students find out about the project? Where did you advertise it?
The Social Science Centre.
Yeah.
You'd have to ask those now who are more. A lot of it's online, but there are some deep connections into specific spaces in Lincoln. And I think one of the things that's very important is that there are technologies that support this as a commons, but it's rooted in Lincoln. It's grounded in a place. The place is the concrete place is really important. People are connected to the place. They're connected to the communities that they exist in inside the place. So I think that the concrete place is really important. Should we go to the point? You.
Thank you. You know, I really enjoyed talking. It's been quite thought-provoking, and like the way you sort of showing the tensions a lot of the time. Like you say, there isn't basically a solution to the how do we do it kind of question. So, I suppose the thoughts that were occurring to me were about like the way you did it, thinking through Marx to earlier work as a kind of workers' cooperative, which then I guess it would be like thinking about, okay, so we're thinking there's this socially useful thing, and we can try to create non-capitalist relations that can try to deliver it in some way. And then I guess my two questions that came out of that work are, what's the socially useful thing? Because it seems like that's one of the problems. It's like, is it really a bundle of knowledge that we're providing to someone, and that's the commodity that's a good thing that society wants, but unfortunately it's currently being delivered through capitalist relations, and that's perverting it? Or, which we'd want to think it is, or is it really accreditation by the state, that the state is saying you've gone through the process of acquiring a certain status, and therefore you're ready to be in a certain position within society? It's sort of both, I suppose, which is why it's one of the tensions. And then the other thing, I guess, is who's the cooperation between? Because when you describe the social science centre, it sounds a bit like you've got the lecturers and the students, and it's like, so is it a producers cooperative, in which case there aren't any lecturers and students, or is it
Yep.
or is it a consumers cooperative, in which case everyone's a student?
Yeah.
And it seems like that's another of the problems that it's not quite clear how we deal with that, basically.
They argue quite strongly that they are a producers cooperative, so unincorporated producers cooperative, that they're a community. It's back to that medieval idea that the university is a scholarly community, a self-governing scholarly community, and they're very clear that the idea of that the idea that in that Mike Neary writes this article on how do revolutionary teachers teach, and it's effectively by abolishing themselves, so that the student becomes the owner of their own, in partnership, becomes the owner of their own learning. He kind of references Vygotsky as in his kind of proper, not his like neoliberal zone of proximal development, become more resilient, grab the next skill, generate human capital, but in a way that's like properly revolutionary in terms of how you think about your own essence as an individual and as a social individual, So he writes about that, and so I think that you're dead right to raise that, because I think that a lot of the thinking inside that, which is also playing out in that, when I was talking about the kind of governance and how does the board relate to the management team, relate to the delivery teams, relate to the students so you'll have that relationship at Leicester Vaughn College, which is at the moment is teacher and student, but actually that wants to become a producer cooperative, so that's going to be scholars, but then they've got a relationship to the board of the Cooperative University, and then that's got its own set of bundle of relationships, which actually are more societal as well, because obviously it's related to the broader cooperative movement, both in the UK emanating out of Manchester, and then its federation, and also internationally. So there's all of those things, but it's very clear, I think, that in that moment that it is not a consumer cooperative, it's a producer cooperative, and the idea is, well, how does it then stitch into a sort of a wider solidarity economy of social cooperatives, and then how does it relate to the state is a big one, and I'm quite interested in that sort of work that Marx does around the Paris Commune, for instance, but also those kind of Russian agrarian communities that he was thinking about towards the end of his life as well, and how are they constructed. And I think this is part of that Rosa Luxemburg's kind of argument with Lenin about the relationship between the state and the proletariat, and those intermediary kind of organisations that might be the cooperative, and will they degenerate, and how much power does the state have, and is it enabling, or actually is it disabling? You remind me of it's that Lucas plan, isn't it? For socially useful production. And that that they're groundbreaking on a whole range of things, that actually you want us to do this, and you want us to reorganise to do this, and you're going to cut and all of that, but actually here's a whole range of useful things we can make that enable us to kind of challenge climate change or renewable energy or whatever it might be, that's like from the 70s or whenever it is. So having a proper, and part of the way in which we would rethink that would potentially enable us to, because at the moment we outsource all our solutions to global crises to the boffins. So it's the academics will be all right because the technologists will save us. We'll be pumping stuff into the atmosphere and it'll reflect back the sun's rays and yada yada yada, and it'll all be okay. Rather than thinking about the mode of production, and we collectively might redefine what that looks like, but we don't have a sense of what those. It's just knowledge, isn't it? And it's just subject-based knowledge. So you'll get your BA in accountancy, and it'll all be cool. But we don't have a way of redefining what we produce at the level of society that's interdisciplinary or that's cross sectors. Not to say that I have to know everything about everything, because I know very little about very little, but that we don't necessarily outsource socially useful knowledge elsewhere. But we don't even have that conversation, it strikes me. But we might inside these spaces, so that's another chink of hope, potentially. It's a really important point that you raise. And then how do we think about that in terms of there's quite a rich seam of knowledge around kind of indigenous knowledges as well, and sort of knowledges that have been made marginal because they don't deliver enough value to the system. But those are the ways of thinking about the world, and what your relationship in that moment is between you and your communities, your ancestors, your land as well. All of those things that are stitched together, and how might we rethink, therefore, the use of the world and our relationship to nature is, how do we bring that in as well? That's really interesting, I think. Oh, it's hurt my head.
This follows on really from David's point. I was thinking about this, the idea of the sort of teaching as a craft ideology, because I'm doing a PGC at BCU, so I want to teach social science in colleges, high level students and access students, and they're pushing this really
think in part we come back to that idea of is it a mode of consumption or a mode of production, and what therefore is it a mode of producing, and therefore is it as a, because when you were speaking I was thinking about it, I was wondering if you're going down the kind of the teaching as an act of love, it's a labour of love, isn't it? You know what I mean? You do what you self-harm because you love what you do and you love your students and you love, you know, teaching. It is, you know, we love it, don't we? We love people, and we want these people to flourish and all that, so we'll self-harm over it. You know, I mean, we'll ignore the damage, and I was wondering if you could...
Presented in a very humanistic kind of...
Yeah. And I think one of the things is to kind of, because I guess those tropes like craft get fetishized as you can become a craftsperson, craftswoman in that space around that thing, and that is your craft, and that's your human capital is wrapped up in that. I guess within the context of the governance and the organising principles for the politics of the cooperative, we're outing that, and there is a craft, because you're crafting something. There is a craft in there, but it isn't defining. It's not a definitional thing. I don't think. I think it's part of that is around privilege and status and power, and who has that. And actually, does it operate? I guess like those. My understanding of those kind of old workshops where you used to produce sort of Stradivarius violins, where you'd have masters working with craftsmen, working with apprentices, journeymen in there, or journeys people in there, and people would be, because on day one of week one of doing your introductory counselling course, you're not necessarily at the same position as you are when you're doing your masters, but you would like a community that was working together on the space and also on the delivery of the thing, because ideally we would want some of those more experienced individuals to be working with those less experienced individuals and to be tweaking their performance, so it doesn't have to be the superstar professor delivering. There's a more communal approach to the craft of creating the violin or the socially useful piece of knowledge or whatever it is, and I think that those all need to be thought about as well.
Some of my favourite writings on education are Adorno's writings on education. He's talking about, and he talks about like one of the things he says, like one of the biggest contradictions within sort of like education for autonomy or education for liberation is like what he calls technical authority, and it literally is just the fact that people are more further along in their knowledge about any specific thing than others. So there is always that kind of like, I suppose this comes back to that thing from abolish yourself as an educator.
Yeah, and that liberation is embedded within that. Does anyone else want to say anything? Anyone who hasn't spoken, or anyone? You don't have to say something if you haven't spoken. There is a.
I know you talked about cooperative platforms.
Yeah, indeed. Trying to find that. Where's that? Yeah. So, I think that there has been quite a lot of obviously Cernychek has written quite a lot, I suppose, around some of the possibilities for. I mean, automation is historically, in the literature, Marx writes about this quite a lot. Andre Gortz writes about it quite a lot. That technology is your way of enabling all of the mundanity of production of producing the necessities of life we can do it over here. We use technology to do it over here. So it's always carried that really deep binary set of tensions between the potential for liberation, but also the that inside the space that we currently operate in, it deeply proletarianizes and deeply alienates because we are reduced to watch people of the machine, or more work is dumped on us because professional services colleagues are sacked, restructured. We end up having to validate processes all the way down the line inside the institution. The responsibilities are heaped down onto sort of individual academics. So there is that real tension, but there is in things like the peer-to-peer university, in those peer-to-peer spaces, in terms of digital commons, there is quite a lot of liberatory potential seen, and certainly in that Ecuadorian example, and certainly there are other more wider, the CyberSyn project example in Allende's Chile is held. There's a brilliant PhD thesis by Jessica Medina Miller about that, MIT 2005. It's one of the best PhD theses I've ever read. And she writes about that CyberSyn project and what it was attempting to do in terms of the production of society and people's accessing the realm of necessity. So how do we allocate resources to different groups? So there are those examples, and certainly from within the Flock Society. Let's spell Ecuador. I've gone brain dead. Is it that? That's it. Thank you. See you. Take care. The Flock Society had its. It's not going to be on there, is it? I didn't think I can email some stuff out anyway. It's a free Libra open knowledge society, and there were some individuals like Michael Bowens, who's kind of heavily involved in sort of peer-to-peer related work, using the idea of the digital in order to make open the idea of liberatory, emancipatory knowledge. That actually there is stuff that is being commodified inside institutions, and we need to liberate it. It's ours. We created it. It's been through private property. It's been alienated from us, and now someone else makes value over it, and they rent it back to us because they're digital publishers or whatever. But actually, that stuff exists, and that the Flock Society, we're working with the kind of Ecuadorian government to try to reimagine the production of Ecuadorian society using oil-based revenues as the kind of the pivot for that, as the starting point for that. We have this, so what are we going to do with it then? Trying to move beyond the kind of social democratic, in its kind of liberal 20th century, non-sort of German 19th century approach, trying to move away from that, to be kind of a radical reimagination of Ecuadorian society, and it failed, but we have those historic examples of the ways in which people have attempted to use technology to redefine society differently. We just kind of don't have a very radical imagination of that in the here and now, say, inside UK higher education, because we're obsessed with Blackboard and Panopto and Turnitin, and we have core systems modernisation and all of those things, and that's the limit of our imagination with those things. But they are being used elsewhere to do different things. The slide that I didn't go on, there's some really interesting stuff around the platform. There's some really interesting stuff of critiques coming out around platform cooperativism. So can we flip those platforms that are currently being used, as Gary Hall at Coventry talks about, the kind of Uberification of the university, and talks about the ways in which those platforms are being used to further proletarianise through processes, production of knowledge, the commodification of assessment, content, curriculum design, curriculum delivery moments. So you break it all down, and you effectively sort of digitise those moments. You resell those moments to individual consumers of those moments. That there are those problems with it, but the argument, and certainly we see, say, there's some work being done in Barcelona, for instance. Forget what the name of the I can send you some stuff anyway. I can send you some links on that, where they're very focused upon the idea of technological sovereignty for citizens. So citizens having access to technological platforms, citizens having access to the kind of content of those and the algorithms, deciding on the algorithms that underpin those. And obviously there's a whole series of issues, aren't there, with those around issues to do with stop and search, whether we can use facial recognition at the Notting Hill Carnival, the police's use of particular algorithms to identify certain individuals and all of that, and whether they force particular, whether that's heavily racialized, for instance. So there's a lot of work going on in terms of thinking about this, as I said, the platform cooperativism consortium, in terms of what redesigning the structures of those technological platforms might look like, and how they might enable different ways of constructing, either allocating resources or generating resources, distributing resources, enabling people to get access to those resources, rather than it solely being mediated by corporations and the market through a commodity structure. So there's a lot of work that's going on there, and I think the important thing is, can we talk about those? Are there ways in which we can transpose them into our organisations, or is the game over there, so we have to do the Saturday morning, Tuesday evening thing, and we all have to do it externally? One of the important things for me is that we have to talk about these things. So my own website, for instance, is hosted by a radical. I don't host it on my institution's technological space, which is it's WordPress, and I had it set up, but it's still a corporate space. It supports the work of May First People Link, which is a kind of radical democratic organisation out of New York. So there are ways in which we might, and there's all sorts of stuff around this that they're doing. So again, I don't have an answer, because I don't have any answers at all. But there are examples. We have examples, I think, in other settings and other contexts of the ways in which you're dead right, those technologies have been used to do different things. It becomes then a problem, though, doesn't it? Because certainly in terms of the work that we might do at a trade union level, we point out some of these things, and we try to talk about the use of technologies for more democratic ends. And we might talk about the problems with these core systems. We talk about some of the issues that we're having with, I don't know, the imposition of lecture capture in an institution, which materially affects pedagogic practice inside the classroom. You force people to behave in specific ways. You potentially close down certain voices in that space. We might, we talk about those at a trade union level, and we try to have conversations with management, but they don't get very far, and that's a real problem, not having voice when there is not a set of alternatives. I've realised I'm really good at people giving me really interesting questions and then not having a goddamn clue about possibilities. I mean, there are possibilities, but what we might, there are no blueprints.
No, I'm just looking at the interface at the moment of the digital with the benefit system, income support, social security, and it strikes me that I guess going sideways a bit, in terms of open source software and so on, there's a fantastic culture of sharing and dialogue,
Yeah.
which is to programming and platform creation. And when you look at the actual policy political context, one of the biggest disjunctions is between, there's at least two big disjunctions. One, which you've touched on, which is the narrative, the structure of the narrative of governance and process, which is very top down, very authoritarian. So the dialogue about the digital becomes a dialogue between hierarchy and contractor. So there's an instrumentalisation of the digital relationship there. And looking at it from the other end of the tube, there's also a culture within the digital community, especially big corporates, of digitalisation as legalism, contract, performance indicators, deliverables, etc. So there's these two highly technocratic structures which are interwoven, and it doesn't seem to leave much space.
Well, I think you're right, because inside a kind of global economy that's struggling to get forms of accumulation back on track, and the kind of productive economy is effectively failing, the rentier economy, the rental economy, is, that's a place to drive into if you want to extract value. So your ability to monetize my engagement with your content in order to make better content, and then charge me more for doing that, is kind of fundamental. Ursula Hughes has written quite a lot about that, and the way in which individuals being always on task in those digital environments and then giving constant feedback into the environment furthers your alienation in that environment.
In the area that I'm looking at, there is some hope
Yeah.
in some respects, in that there is such a massive disconnect, serious
Yeah.
disconnect in the English, British arena, but the Scottish approach, they've taken a different approach, and they've talked about the delivery of income support in terms of a more collaborative model. And so the notion of co-production is written into that narrative of governments. How far they'll operationalise that remains open to question.
Yeah.
That's a good thing, because they're at the start of that process. So in a sense, the notion of co-production is very much up for grabs at the moment. And they're experimenting along different lines of the policy process and different segments of the policy process. But the important thing is they've started forging those connections between governance, programming and people, and so creating spaces.
I think that's important, and the thing that you reminded me of was some of the work that's going on around open data that does offer a, you know, in the same way that say the Office for Students saying this is our new regulatory approach, which enables a cooperative university to say, yeah, hell, we'll walk into that because it's an opportunity, right? And we're going to waste the opportunity. Actually, you know, the government's also obsession with open data, which is driven around the creation of new services that can be commodified, actually offers a moment, because there are a lot of people working in those spaces around, well, actually, how do we give citizens then better access to information about services? How do we enable planning to happen better that enables services for the elderly, for people who are frail living at home, connecting carers into that space? So how do we generate stuff that's more communal in terms of service provision? And we'll co-opt that, because the system wants to co-opt it, but is it possible for us to co-opt that and to do something different? So you are right, and actually thank you for reminding me that whilst I talk about a kind of lack of hope and a dystopian thing, I think you're dead right to remember that actually the system tries to valorize everything, but there are certain things it can't valorize. You know, our hearts, love, all of that becomes, it wants to, but it finds it very difficult to, because it kind of can't, it's going to try and get in between you and me, but actually there's a possibility between you and me for being outside of that space, and there's lots of that, and I think we do need to remember that, and all of that whole mess of stuff that's happening inside voluntary organisations and voluntary societies, and that happens in terms of people caring for others, and that happens at 7 at night and on a Saturday. You are dead right, I think, to remind us that there are all of those moments of hope, that actually if your man was still here, we could potentially talk about the ways in which that enables new forms of social innovation then, with a cooperative ethos, if we can keep that alive. So I think you're dead right.
I think you also, sorry, was there anybody else that wanted to ask a question?
Let me ask a content question, because you know the stuff about Rosa Luxemburg and your generation.
Yeah.
Is that in relationship to the SPD and all the?
Yeah. When did she write that? 1919, I think. I can send you some stuff. Yeah, but it's deliberately focused on cooperatives.
I was only going to say that the neoliberal machine, if you like, has been talking about spaces of hope, the neoliberal machine has been batting off challenges, and fairly successfully in some respects. However, for me, there are little bits of hope in that you can see the imprint of those challenges
think that's right. I mean, Marx is quite clear that it undermined that the production cooperatives in particular undermine the groundwork of capital. They undermine it as a system because they offer an alternative. He doesn't say that they're utopian and they're going to solve everything, but actually there is an element of kind of consciousness raising within that moment because we're all co-producing the other thing. So I think that's really important for us to remember.
And also, I mean, I won't go on about this, but also factoring in environmental dynamics. It was, for example, it was Hurricane Katrina that exposed vulnerabilities around the subprime market.
Yeah.
And
I think, well, it's the deep interconnections, isn't it, between those things, the environmental, the housing, the welfare, the education, the whatever. And I think, well, there are just two final things. The first is the crack thing is John Holloway's from Crack Capitalism, and it is really, and it's effectively, you know, inside this totality, what are you going to do to kind of, and you can't break the whole thing, but we could potentially join those. And if we're going to join those cracks, then what are the narratives we need in order to, you know, to do that, to generate that, and that then becomes, that's a fundamental thing to kind of elevate those, to widen those cracks. Then with the idea that we can potentially then see beyond. So there isn't a utopian position we can get to, but that we can then kind of see beyond. And that cracks thing is his, and it's really important, I think. And I said there were two things, but I've forgotten the second. So what are we going to do? Doesn't matter, does it? Doesn't matter.
I just think it's important to
Yeah.
join up those dots, as you say, but also think about non-human and inhuman forces, and you know, the state of digital development now is
Yeah.
becoming
Yeah.
a reflexive, disruptive force in and of itself.
It is, and the non-human and inhuman is really important. I've remembered it. John Narayan from BCU spoke at the symposium in whenever it was, February, March time, and that was really powerful. And he spoke about, you know, the experiences that he spoke about at the margins of inhumanity at the margins. That are now, I think one of the points I took away was that those who were notionally privileged inside this system that's failing are now experiencing that. And that's a pivotal thing, and that I think that in that moment your ability to begin to develop those discourses and to say here's a set of cooperative alternatives that might do something different is quite interesting.